It wasn't the kind of monster you saw in movies. He didn't hide in the shadows. He was the shadow. He didn't kill for ideology, not for money, not for revenge. He killed because he wanted to. He didn't knock. He didn't sneak. He entered through unlocked windows, opened doors, and sometimes just walked right in. He called himself the Night Stalker. The media called him a monster. But behind the black eyes and the rotten teeth was a man with a past, a man with a mind twisted by violence, worship, and something darker. He left no pattern. He showed no mercy. He crossed neighborhoods, counties, even identities. He was a ghost with a gun, a shadow with a blade, a devil with a smile. For months, he gripped Los Angeles in a chokehold of fear. No one knew where he would strike next. No one knew what he wanted. And worst of all, no one could stop him. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about a city that slept with one eye open, a courtroom turned circus, and a killer who whispered, "Hail Satan," and smiled. This is the story of Richard Ramirez. This is the mind of a killer. Before the black eyes, before the courtroom stares and the whispered words, evil, there was just a boy, quiet, watching, waiting. His name was Richard. He was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, the youngest of 5 children in a strict working-class household. His parents, first-generation immigrants, tried to keep order through hard work, discipline, and deep religious devotion. But inside the home, chaos often ruled. Richard's father, a former law officer turned railroad worker, brought more than just rules. He brought a volatile temper, one that could ignite without warning. Arguments would explode into violence, doors slammed, voices rose, and Richard, small, nervous, would slip away into the night. Sometimes he ran to a park, sometimes to a friend's porch, but more often, he went to the cemetery. At just 10 years old, Richard would lay among the headstones, staring up at the stars, listening to the silence of the dead, because it was quieter than the world he came from. But silence has a way of letting darkness in. Everything changed the day his cousin came home from war. Mike, once a decorated soldier, returned with medals and stories. He told Richard about combat, about survival, but it wasn't heroism he shared. It was something else. He showed him photos, disturbing ones, images of what people were capable of when power went unchecked. He spoke of violence as if it were a language, and he was fluent. To Richard, barely a teenager, it was overwhelming and fascinating. Mike didn't just tell stories, he taught lessons. How to move silently, how to handle weapons, how to detach emotion from action. This was a new kind of education. And then one afternoon, while Richard sat on a sofa only a few feet away, it all became real. Mike, mid-argument with his partner, reached for a firearm and pulled the trigger. Richard didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply watched. Something inside him didn't recoil. It absorbed. After that, something shifted. Richard stopped attending school. He began drifting, spending long hours wandering the city alone. He became obsessed with control, power, and dark philosophies that turned traditional values upside down. He started exploring mind-altering substances, using them to blur the line between reality and fantasy. Daylight became his enemy, the night his sanctuary. He broke into homes not just to steal, but to invade space, to feel what it meant to cross someone's boundaries and remain unseen. He would stand in living rooms, touch kitchen counters, move objects ever so slightly, and then disappear into the dark. The world was asleep. But Richard Ramirez was wide awake. By the time he left El Paso for Los Angeles, He wasn't looking for a fresh start. He was looking for something else. Something he could no longer quiet. Something that had been whispering to him since the cemetery. Los Angeles, the city of angels, a place of endless sun, neon lights, and locked doors that didn't always stay locked. By the time Richard Ramirez arrived in California, he was no longer just a troubled young man. He was a creature of habit and darkness. He slept during the day, moving through cheap motels and bus stations, always quiet, always watching. At night, he came alive. He wandered the streets with no fixed destination, shoes worn thin, eyes constantly scanning. He took alleyways over sidewalks, rooftops over roadways. He didn't just move through the city, he studied it. Ramirez became obsessed with the idea of entering spaces unnoticed. He started by opening doors. No plan, no tools, just testing. Apartment buildings, houses, townhomes. And in Los Angeles, he discovered something terrifying. People left their windows open, their doors unlocked, their lives unguarded. It was like the city was inviting him in. He continued exploring disturbing beliefs, dark rituals, symbols, practices tied to power through fear. He read obsessively about those who had committed terrible acts and convinced themselves they were chosen. He admired that, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he wanted to be free. He fed that growing void with mind-altering substances. They blurred the lines between his thoughts and the world around him. The more the night swallowed him, the more he craved control. Control over his surroundings, control over fear, control over life. And then one night, he crossed a line he could never return from. It wasn't planned, it wasn't even careful, but it was successful. The rush he felt wasn't excitement, it was confirmation. He hadn't broken into a home, he'd stepped into a new identity. From that moment on, the streets of Los Angeles weren't streets anymore. They were a hunting ground. Every open window, every porch light, every alleyway. A door to a new story he could write in bloodless silence. The Night Stalker wasn't born overnight. He became one choice at a time, one night at a time, one soul at a time. It started quietly. No announcements, no warnings, just the sound of a window sliding open, and the night holding its breath. Richard Ramirez didn't follow patterns. He didn't stalk his victims for weeks. He didn't choose based on age, gender, or appearance. He chose based on opportunity, an unlocked door, a ground floor window, a light left on too late. The first known act was brutal, but barely noticed. A break-in, a violent encounter, a shaken survivor, but no clear suspect. No one knew a serial threat had been born, but over the weeks that followed, the city began to change. The intrusions became bolder. Ramirez moved between neighborhoods, from modest suburbs to high-end homes. He struck in San Gabriel, then Glendale, then Mission Viejo. There was no map, no logic, only chaos. He entered silently, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes not stealing a thing, just watching moving objects, leaving behind fear. Other times he took what he wanted, valuables, keepsakes, small personal items. But those weren't trophies, they were reminders, souvenirs of power. His face remained unknown, his methods inconsistent. He used weapons he found at the scene, or brought his own. He changed vehicles, he changed clothes, he changed everything, except the fact that he always came back at night. Word spread fast. The media called him the Night Stalker, and for good reason. He didn't just break into homes, he broke into the city's sense of safety. People bought locks, people bought dogs, people slept with lights on, or not at all. But it didn't stop him. He moved faster, he escalated. What began as break-ins turned into full-blown home invasions. Victims were no longer just robbed. They were targeted, terrorized, sometimes spared, sometimes not. by his whim alone, and all the while he smiled. This wasn't a man trying to hide. This was a man who believed he couldn't be touched. Los Angeles wasn't dealing with a killer in the traditional sense. It was dealing with something else, something hunting for fear itself. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was no longer sleeping, not fully, not peacefully. The fear wasn't isolated anymore. It wasn't whispered in backyards or hushed across fences. It was on the front page, in every neighborhood, on every late-night news broadcast. People weren't just locking their doors, they were barricading them. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, families slept in shifts, and in some homes, children were moved into the same room as their parents, not for comfort, but for survival. The media had given him a name, the Night Stalker, and that name sent chills through a city already sweating in the California heat. He was described as a shadow, young, fast, ruthless. He left behind fear instead of fingerprints, and when he did leave a trace, it only deepened the panic. One key clue would echo through every station, a single footprint left in a flower bed, a rare sneaker tread that investigators desperately hoped would break the case. But it didn't. He kept moving, from county to county, from city to city. He changed faces depending on the victim's memory. He changed weapons, depending on what he could find. He changed tactics, just when police thought they were closing in. And worse, he seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. At one scene, he left a message scrawled across the wall, not in blood, not in words we'll repeat, but in a language meant to instill terror, to toy with investigators, and to feed the legend the press was building around him. The Los Angeles Police Department worked day and night. The FBI was now involved. Task forces were formed, hundreds of tips came in, but nothing stuck. Ramirez didn't fit the profile of a serial offender. There was no psychological consistency, only a growing confidence. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was claiming space. He was daring the city to catch him. And while detectives struggled to connect the dots, residents took up their own defense. Neighborhood watch groups swelled. People began to patrol their own streets. Some carried whistles, others carried more. And all the while, Ramirez continued to roam. Underground, unnoticed, unpredictable. Los Angeles had seen crime before, but never like this. Never someone who could disappear into the dark and take the city's peace with him. The Night Stalker was no longer just a name in the papers. He was an idea, a whisper, a nightmare, and he was far from finished. When Richard Ramirez was finally caught, it wasn't by police. It wasn't by the FBI. It was the people who stopped him. In August of 1985, after months of horror, a single mistake cracked the case. A fingerprint lifted from a stolen vehicle finally led to a name and a face. His mugshot was broadcast across every news station, printed in every paper. And just days later, Ramirez walked into the wrong neighborhood. Recognized by a bystander, chased down by a crowd, held until officers arrived. The man who once moved through the night with ghost-like freedom was now bloodied, handcuffed, and very, very real. But even in chains, he didn't flinch. When brought before cameras, he smiled. In court, he flashed a hand signal associated with his beliefs and said one thing: "Hail, Satan." The courtroom froze. This was no longer a trial. It was a spectacle, a media storm, a stage where fear, fascination, and obsession collided. Ramirez arrived every day dressed in black, sunglasses, a smirk, sometimes no expression at all. He disrupted proceedings. He laughed at testimony. He received love letters from admirers, even marriage proposals. To some, he was a monster. To others, he was a myth in real time. But the evidence was clear. Over the course of the trial, Jurors were shown fingerprints, ballistics, shoe impressions, and personal items taken from homes across California. His victims, those who survived, spoke bravely, and those who didn't were remembered in every breathless silence between testimonies. The trial lasted over 4 years, one of the longest and most expensive in California's history. Dozens of charges, countless delays, and an accused man who seemed completely untouched by the weight of it all. In the end, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, and more than a dozen additional felonies. When asked for final words, he said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory." It wasn't remorse, it wasn't denial. It was a final act of defiance. He was sentenced to death, but he wouldn't die quickly. For the next 2 decades, Ramirez remained on death row, writing letters, reading philosophy, and never once claiming regret. To him, the trial was just another room, another audience, another place to be watched. Richard Ramirez was locked away. His trial was over, his name printed, televised, archived, but his presence never really left. Even behind bars at San Quentin, he remained a figure of unsettling fascination. There were no public apologies, no interviews filled with regret, no breakdowns of emotion. Instead, he became an icon of darkness. He gave interviews, calm, cryptic, and emotionless. He spoke about power, about fear, about the night. He received mail from people around the world. Some hated him, some feared him, and disturbingly, some adored him. He never begged for life, never confessed to anything beyond what the court proved. He simply existed in silence, exactly the way he had operated in the world. But the true legacy he left behind wasn't in his words. It was in what he took. He stole more than lives. He stole peace of mind. Entire neighborhoods would never sleep the same again. Parents triple-checked locks. Communities that once felt safe began living differently. And even years later, in books, documentaries, and whispered conversations, the same question echoed, why didn't anyone see it coming? Richard Ramirez didn't fit the mold. He didn't follow rules. He became something else entirely. Not a man, not a monster, but a shadow that reminded the world of something far more terrifying, that danger doesn't always wear a mask. In 2013, Richard Ramirez died in prison from health complications. No final words, no ceremony, just a name, ending in silence. But his story remains, in court records, in nightmares, and in the eyes of a city that once lived in fear of a man who came and went with the night. Richard Ramirez killed without logic. He struck at night. He left cities trembling, but his terror was loud, obvious, explosive. What if the next monster didn't prowl in darkness, but knocked on your door with a soft smile? What if evil didn't scream? What if it whispered? In the next episode of The Mind of a Killer, we travel back nearly a century to New York City in the 1920s, where a quiet, gray-haired man wandered the streets. He wore a suit, he carried letters, and inside his mind lived something unspeakable. He was a father, a churchgoer, a painter of saints, and something else entirely. He called himself many names. The world would remember just one: the Gray Man. Next week, the chilling descent into the mind of Albert Fish, only on The Mind of a Killer.